Okay, thank you, Chad. So tonight we have the great pleasure to welcome Professor Mcdermott and Professor Sean Kelly for this wonderful weekend about Jung and Steiner, or Steiner and Jung, depending on where you are. Yeah. Many of us know already who are those two great professors of the CIIS. Professor Mcdermott has many times contributed to our San Francisco program of Rudolf Steiner College here with many lectures as I'm here, since I'm here in San Francisco. As you know or don't know, but it's on the program, he is the President Emeritus of the CIIS and has a wonderful life as a philosopher, particularly interested in the relationships between Rudolf Steiner and other streams, between philosophy of the West and the philosophy of the East. His books show that interest, particularly, I think, Rudolf Steiner and Aurobindo, maybe, and also, of course, all those great figures in our culture which are representing a great contribution to the development of humanity. He's actually still teaching at the CIIS in the Department of Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness. Maybe I will mention a few of his books. The most known maybe is the Essential Aurobindo, the New Essential Steiner, but also I've seen, I went, on Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a wonderful encyclopedia, And I have been really interested to discover, because it's a discovery, that you had also William James essays in psychical research done in 1986. Wonderful. Wow. And of course, his interest also for the Bhagavad Gita is very well known and very deep. As to Professor Kelly, Sean Kelly is also a professor at the CIIS in the Department of Philosophy, Cosmology, and Religion. And I know him because he speaks French too. And we enjoy sometimes to speak French together. And he's a great philosopher too, very much interested by Hegel. I have seen that. I think it was your PhD thesis, on Hegel. And the French philosopher I know well too, Edgar Morin, which is a great contribution to our epoch also as a philosopher. And so tonight we have a duo of great philosophers about that question of can we bring those two great figures, Jung and Steiner, in dialogue. So they will introduce their work of the weekend for 45 minutes, each of them, and then they will have a kind of discussion between those two philosophers, and then they will open the floor to your questions. And we should be done at 9:30 to come back tomorrow morning. Thank you. So help me to welcome warmly those two great.
Do I need this?
You don't need it.
Want to take it? Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Lots of friends and colleagues familiar. It's wonderful. And those of you who don't know, hello. I hope we have a good weekend together. So my friend Sean and I are giving a course at in our department called Steiner and Jung. It's taken us a while to get to that place where he's been doing Jung, I've been doing Steiner, and then we just figured we really have to get them to make up for what they didn't accomplish, actually. They were living just a half hour apart from each other, and they managed to miss each other completely. It's easier in the next generation to do that. Sometimes when these great figures are building a body of work, they're not that good at peripheral vision. They're really better at digging in deeper and deeper with the people who share their vision. So we're doing a little comparisons, contrasts, and we're very good friends, even though they weren't. So we'll see what we can do about that. So tonight we're each going to talk about the life and the work of these two figures, and then we'll exchange a little bit unrehearsed, and then we'll have some questions. And we'll do something like that tomorrow, as Irene said. So one of the important, I think it's a fact, but characteristics of Rudolf Steiner's life and work is that the esoteric, the deep, the spiritual, the mysterious, the somewhat inaccessible part, and the completely public, accessible, kind of ordinary part constantly interpenetrate. So this is not the kind of a mystic, in a cave, just desperate for 24/7 silence. He was really in the world through his entire life. And at the same time, he really was a spiritual being in the sense that all the ordinary things that he seemed to be doing were all expressions of something much deeper that he knew about as he went along, and we tried to figure out and try to see how those relate to each other. So tonight I'm doing a biography, and so part of what I'll be saying is, when was he born? I may not even mention that, actually. And the other part is, well, who was his master that initiated him into some huge spiritual work? And they are intimately related. And so lots of people pay attention to biographies, but not much with context and not much with, the mysterious part. Steiner really paid attention to all the layers of the self, the physical, the etheric, the life self, then the soul level, the personality quality, and then this karmic sense of the I that comes into the world with a task and a mission and then the person tries to find what is that mission, who do I work with, and who's out to get me, and that whole drama that unfolds, sometimes in a way that's quite beautiful and graced, and sometimes in a way that's mixed with a lot of pain and suffering, tragedy. All right? Okay, so Rudolf Steiner had the great opportunity to be born in the natural world, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, surrounded by mountains and beautiful access to nature. At the same time, his father was a station master on the big train that would come through. And so he had that mechanical side, which Steiner himself cultivated. And he also had this beautiful relationship, a kind of shamanic relationship to the natural world. And very often with Steiner, you say on the one hand, on the other hand, and they're not contradictory hands. They work together pretty well in a highly evolved person. So he was I guess we would say he was a working class person, as they were not extremely poor, but they were certainly not affluent. There were 3 children, and his father had this job, and so we really come to see him in his distinctness at around age 7, when he's in the station house, and a figure appears to him asking for help. And so he's doesn't quite know what to make of it. It's a kind of a ghostly figure. She asks for his help. He doesn't say what he said to her, but she then left. And then the next day, he overheard his parents talking about his father's cousin who had committed suicide. So we can get a glimpse into who this person is, in a certain sense, from her vantage point. There she is on the other side, right? She's ended her life, and the next day, she's looking for help. And so we would think she would go to an adult, someone with some life experience. But the world must be such that now we're going into Steiner's worldview, that he already, at age 7, was a highly evolved soul as a result of a previous life or previous lives. Okay? So she could see from this vantage an evolved soul, even though the evolved soul is in the biography at that point of a 7-year-old. So already life is different from what most of us think, or we may think that sometimes, but we don't always think that, and it's not really what our culture thinks. So it's a bit of a kind of a wake moment. Wow. So she could see that in him. What is the world like that she had that consciousness, that he could be seen, that she would know to ask him, that he would know not to say anything about it, all that stuff just in a little episode that gives us a clue, a glimpse. And then another moment that his teacher gave him a book in geometry, and he began to see that there was a language that he could use for his interior experience, his experience kind of his, let's call it his Platonic life, his life of ideal forms. He now is getting a language for that. And then at 14, he saw in a bookstore a book with a red cover, and it had, in German, of course, Immanuel Kant, Critique of Pure Reason. And he knew at 14, that's waiting for me. I have to do that. And with his little amount of his savings, his allowance, we call it, he bought that book and then began to read it. And Buber also began to work on the Critique of Pure Reason at 14, and as did Jung and Hannah Arendt and some other people. If you want to get in the game, if you want to have a say, you really have to deal with Kant, because Kant was the one who set the line and said, above the line, you can't have knowledge. You can have some kind of knowledge, but not real knowledge. You can't have certain knowledge. You can have sort of moral knowledge, you can have belief, you can have this and that, but you can't have scientific knowledge. All right, and so that was a kind of a throwing down of a gauntlet to the modern world, and most of the world went with it. And some of these people, like Buber and Steiner and Teilhard and Jung was a little bit ambivalent about it. He had experience that went beyond the Kant's line, but he didn't actually have the philosophical wherewithal to match his experience. I'm sure Sean will probably say something about that. Okay, then at 18, Rudolf Steiner met a man who really was a shaman, a man who gathered herbs and then went into town and sold them, healing potions from the natural world. And Steiner, of course, could see, I shouldn't say of course, as though, well, if you know Steiner, it's of course, and if you just don't know Steiner, then you say what? But he could see the healing powers in these various herbs. And so this became a very beautiful senior-junior friendship. They would ride the train together and they would talk. And this man, Felix Kukutsky, didn't have that many people to talk to because most people couldn't see what he could see in the herbs, and this young man, Steiner, could. And Steiner didn't have anyone to speak to because he didn't know anybody who could see these things either, and also who didn't have the sense of themselves or of him as having some sort of working up to some kind of work, a task, a mission, something. So now this Felix Kukutsky knew to advise Steiner on how to find and go to a person who Steiner refers to as his master. And that's all he says. He said, he sent me to the master, and the master gave him these two jobs: to do what he could philosophically, intellectually, and also practically to help the West recover from materialistic thinking that really began in around the 16th and certainly by the 17th century. The kind of scientific philosophical thinking which basically said that we can't have any knowledge of spiritual realities. All of our knowledge is sense-based, and we can't get above that line. Well, Kant was kind of the ultimate version of the limit because it was so brilliantly articulated. And so that was Steiner's job: take on the West and convince the West that you can and you should think differently. And if you don't, then you will constantly be cut off, alienated from deep sources of wisdom and spiritual insight, and also healing, as a very important part with Jung, because Jung was a healer doctor. I think Steiner was a healer too, but Jung's primary, almost exclusive work was to heal individuals and then thereby to try to heal the culture. And so if you're cut off from deep sources, you can't heal deep illnesses. You can heal superficial ones, but not the deep ones that cause alienation and depression and loss of direction and despair. All right, so the other job that the master, whose name Steiner didn't disclose, and it's not even clear whether the person was a human being on Earth or a human being not on Earth or a non-human being. All we know is that this being Steiner was able to hear what this person said in some way. It could be a dream, it could be a voice, it could be whatever. I don't know. But the second job was to reintroduce karma, the law of the value consequences of thoughts and actions, the enduring value or negative value. It doesn't have to be positive, it can be negative value, the continuity or the endurance of the value of thoughts and deeds. That when you say something and do something, it doesn't just go away. And we're learning that in ecology, there's no away. Well, in spiritual life, there's no away either. It stays, and it continues to work positively, negatively, neutrally. And so Steiner's job was to get the West to try to begin to recover what it once had, particularly in the Greek world, this sense that everything is significant, everything lasts, everything is influential, and especially now if you start thinking about multiple lives. So when you come into a earthly incarnation, you already have a big history, a long biography. I mean, it's to be kind of popular about it. It's another inning in a 9-inning game. All right, maybe longer, I don't know. But anyway, it's like that. You keep what you did last time stays with you in some way. So Steiner wanted to reintroduce that. Now, since Steiner mostly did what he was asked to do by people who came to him for help, he didn't really get a chance to develop that karma and rebirth until fully develop it the way he thought it needed to be until practically the last year of his life, because he didn't know it was going to be the last year of his life. He thought he had a lot more time. But he did develop it. And the other part about changing the thinking was really part of his entire life work. So let me do a little bit on his sources. I think sometimes people who are influenced by someone like Steiner, and particularly someone, if you're influenced by Steiner, there's a tendency to think that they just kind of happened, But I've already tried to emphasize the importance of realizing that it didn't just happen, he happened in a previous life and probably one before that and before that. So he didn't start from nothing, he started as an advanced individual. But the other thing to keep in mind is that all these great figures, even though they may not necessarily talk about them, though Steiner did, they have sources. They have great thinkers and teachers and texts and traditions and practices already established for them. some of which they use and say just say thank you very much, some of which they take up and improve and redirect and do something significant with them. So Steiner has a master who was a guide. I assume the master continued to be his guide. He also was steeped in the science and the aesthetics, the artwork of Goethe. And so when he was 21, he was given the job of editing Goethe's scientific writing. So right from the beginning, he was steeped in that scientific worldview. And Steiner himself went to kind of the Austrian MIT. He had a degree in science in both undergraduate and in his doctoral work was in epistemology, but also in philosophy of science. So he really was a person very much of the world, in the world, and not sort of hiding out. He also was steeped in German idealism, the philosophers who came after Hegel, who in a certain sense were trying to recover from Hegel and trying to create a philosophy which would have this tremendous sense of spirit and or Geist, something that Sean will probably talk about at some point since he knows all about it.
Robert, I think you meant Kant. They recover from Kant.
Who did I say?
Hegel.
Oh, no, recover from Kant. Thank you. Thank you. See, we help each other. Recover from Kant. I was already saying, how much do I say about Hegel? So the words crept in there. Thank you, Sean. No, recover from Kant. No, Hegel is a recovery from Kant. Then he also has this lineage as a person related to these high beings, particularly Christ, but not only Christ. After he began his esoteric career, he worked on the Krishna of the Bhagavad Gita, and he worked on Buddha, and he kind of had a direct relationship to Buddha. He knew more about Buddha, actually, than he knew about Buddhism. Kind of an interesting, in other words. So it was not a book learning. It was really a direct awareness. Now, the experience of Christ came about in 1899 when he was 39. Sometimes I say the wrong century. 1899, I'm paying attention. So what was that experience like? I mean, it's hard to know and hard to say. But he had an experience not of Jesus of Nazareth, of the New Testament, though to some extent it was the Christ of John's Gospel. He had an experience of Christ as the divine being that was the source and the guide of the evolution of the cosmos, the physical world, with their interior purposes and their striving, and particularly of the earth and humanity. Now, this great, vast being, which in the most amazing moment in human history, joined with the human being, Jesus of Nazareth at the baptism, that Steiner, there we again, so we get that, right? Upper story, earthly story like that. And so Steiner had this experience. And what does it say to say experience? Did he see something? Did he think it? Did it come into his mind, into his soul? I just think of it as a very much of an overwhelming experience. And he says it came after a certain period of struggle. He was trying to find a relationship to Christianity, but he couldn't find a denomination, he couldn't find a church, he couldn't find his way. And there wasn't anything that was speaking about the experiences that he knew about by his clairvoyance, his clear seeing. So he had this great experience, and then he went and to find a community. If you're a great teacher, you have to have some students. So he then was invited by the Theosophists, the people interested in spiritual knowledge, and he then became a teacher in that community. Became the head of the German Theosophical Society, and he started to lecture on Nietzsche and on Goethe, and he also then, his first full lecture cycle or series of lectures is called Christianity as Mystical Fact, where he's trying to talk about the Christianity as a continuation of mystery teaching, of the mystery centers in Egypt and in Greece, where people would come and do a serious a training and preparation, which would then enable them to overcome the grip of their physical being and be able to see spiritual existence kind of directly. So these then, they became initiates. They were initiated. And in this book, Christianity as Mystical Fact, which Sean and I are teaching right now, and of course, Rudolf Steiner says that, Empedocles and Pythagoras and even Ulysses and certainly Socrates and Plato all had these initiation, preparation and experiences that enabled them to see to gain spiritual knowledge. And that's Christianity comes out of that. Now we think of Christianity as coming primarily out of the Jewish tradition, and he doesn't say that's not true. That is also true, because that's where Christianity gets this tremendous sense of history and of divine human dialogue and the moral dimension of experience. All of that is tremendously important. But then he says, but from the Egyptian Greek side, Christianity gets this sense of the mystery center and the transformation of the soul, which enables a person to have spiritual knowledge. So then the Christianity that he wanted to be related to is this Christianity as mystery center, not Christianity so much as in its rituals and in its prayer life, though that's also important. But he was trying to bring something he thought had been lost, this great sense of mystery center. Okay, so now then we're into the 20th century, 1902. Then he writes How to Know Higher Worlds, which is the kind of handbook for doing what he's been able to do on his own without a handbook, and Theosophy, which gives this spiritual worldview about karma and the evolution of consciousness. And then in 1909, he writes a book which, in a certain sense, combines those two. It does in a certain sense, the How to Know Higher Worlds. It also does this long chapter on the evolution of consciousness and many other topics like dreaming and sleeping and dying and etc. And that's quite a significant book, and it's called The Outline of Esoteric Science. And then, having sort of established what he was trying to teach, he then tried to apply it. And so he gets involved with the arts, with the sciences, with architecture, and he designs a magnificent wooden building with certain forms that would enable people to come in and get a kind of an aha, or this tremendous sense of being at home in the physical world in a way that the spiritual of a person could be met by the spiritual dimension of this physical building. So this is built by hand with wood from all over the world, and they're hammering. In the meantime, all the guns are going off around in the First World War with all these countries fighting each other, and the people from those countries are building this building together. It's quite a remarkable picture, I think. And alas, as happened so often with Rudolf Steiner's work, that some negative force broke in, and the Goetheanum, as it was called in honor of Goethe, was just finished when it was burned by arson. So, and Steiner stood there all through the night watching it go up in flames, this building which he not only had designed and worked on with these workers, but in which he had invested the conviction that people really could people in the West could make a relationship between their interior life and at least one physical reality, this architectural kind of a wonder. And that burning of that physical being with a certain life dimension in it, because of all the labor and the sacrifice that went into it, pulled out, I believe, his own life principle, his own etheric body, and it weakened him very, very significantly. And other works that he did also kind of drained him. Sometimes it was just crazy schedules or just so many people just scratching at him and help me do this and that, and how do I do this, and also just making the peace among all these people who are arguing all the time. And one chapter that I actually think was not so painful and kind of nice was that Emil Molt, a owner of a tobacco factory, quite a large factory, invited him to come and create a school for the teachers. For the workers in the factory. And he said, we have all these workers and their children, we don't have any school, and they deserve a good school. And Steiner came and gave lectures on my shelf. It must be, I don't know, 100, 150 lectures, maybe more, on all the way from, the preschool to nursery school to kindergarten to first grade to third to sixth to ninth, and right up to high school, and right down to what to do at snack and which stories to tell and when to introduce geography, what kind of geography, which stories and the myths, and try to keep the child in the imaginal realm as long as possible, which of course we're not doing in our culture. And it's quite beautiful to see his relationship to not just to the teachers, all of whom he recruited, from the world. In other words, they didn't go to teacher training schools. They were in the world. They were bankers and farmers and etc. But also to the children. So he was there in the 8th grade asking them what they're going to do, and of course they're all going to be artists. And he said, well, wait a minute, we're going to need somebody to build and run the trains, and bankers, we're going to need all these practical things. And so he always had that sense that everything needs to be spiritualized. Don't just do spirit by doing spirit. You do spirit by doing what is to be done. And then priests, most of these Lutheran priests came and said, we don't feel that our rituals have a sufficient life. And so he gave them the sacraments to perform. And he didn't join that community, but he gave it to them with his blessing and somehow brought it from the spiritual world. So now we're going to get a chance to talk tonight and tomorrow about how does one do this? How does one do Jungian individuation, and how does one try to make a little progress in this path of initiation that Steiner taught? But just try to keep in mind as we go along that Steiner says anthroposophy is a path of knowledge to lead the spiritual in the individual to the spiritual in the universe. Try to keep that in mind, because it has two parts: self, which he's really devoted to, so he's not one of these social thinkers that just has clusters. It's real, individual, karmically significant beings, and the whole universe, from sticks and stones and sand to the entire cosmos. And the task of human life is to make the relationship by active, participatory response, reverence, humility, all these ways that we can and must make real to us the mysteries and the glories of the universe. So it looks like it's thinking, and it is, but it's thinking that clearly involves affect, involves affection, involves loving. It's, in a certain sense, it's more like loving than what we call thinking. It also involves activity, because you have to make new thoughts. So his whole idea is to think in a way that you're being creative in the act of thinking. It's a brand new thought that you make out of your deepest self. So it's what Coleridge calls imagination. And all of this would be just kind of exciting, except that we actually like to do and to what these tempters, these beings, really high, powerful, brilliant beings, Lucifer and Ahriman, are trying to get us to do. And in fact, they've mostly succeeded in getting us to do, which is not think originally, but think kind of derivatively, right? And not look for spiritual realities, but look for surfaces and what's in front of us and what can we use to our advantage. So in a way, we're drawn to this, or you wouldn't be here. At the same time, even though we are here talking about this and and probably spending a lot of your time and effort in this regard, nevertheless, is a way in which this other dimension of being dependent and being kind of devoted to surfaces is more powerful than what Steiner exemplifies and recommends. The starting fresh every moment with a thought, a feeling, an act of generosity, of humility, which is true to who I have been, which is true to my karmic path, my whole way of accomplishing what I came to do. So he's inviting us into a tremendous adventure, which is both beautiful and difficult. I'm reminded of Spinoza. All things excellent are as beautiful as they are rare. All right, well, have it right? I think so. So that's what he's inviting us to. That's beautiful and rare, and against, sort of in a sense, against the time, against our own time. So we came into this incarnation to take on this task, which our culture gives us, which is mostly dead thinking and inadequate affect. And so we recognize that this is what we should be doing. We should be offsetting what the culture is teaching and rewarding. And so we're in the right place. At the same time, we're also comfortable in this culture. So to do what Steiner is recommending is very much countercultural. And that could be kind of difficult and sometimes it seems not so rewarding. It's kind of hard. It's kind of slow. It's kind of and Steiner, who was able to do these things so brilliantly, paid a price at every turn. I mean, he couldn't get people to do what he was suggesting. He couldn't get them to get along. And he had then, toward the end of his life, when he became very, very famous, he had people showing up who wanted to kill him and certainly prevent him from teaching. And those people then became Nazis, and he became dead because he was dead at 65, probably from some negative forces. I mean, you could say it was exhaustion, but he was exhausted by fighting negative forces in the spiritual world. So if you get into this, or if those of you who are into it, you know that the beings all around, it's a very full cosmos of warring beings. And Steiner was a servant of the love and truth against beings who weren't absolutely evil. They just had their own way of doing something, maybe prematurely, or maybe just with a slight twist that made it not quite right, and yet very inviting, very attractive. Lucifer and Ahriman are very attractive, as we'll do when we get a chance to talk. So I just wanted to give you some sense of who Rudolf Steiner was, maybe even is. How do we know? How do I know? What happened to these great beings? Do they come again? Do they guide us? How do we know about that? That's something to learn about. And that the task is terribly serious, and it has its meaning on a very long trajectory. It's not a quick fix. It's you came to do this if you're here seriously, and you may not do it so well, but it's a preparation. You're going to have another life. You're going to try it again and again. And what it is has something to do with being present to spiritual realities, even though your culture is not. So you've always got to counter. And that's what I think one of the most important things that we learn from Steiner. Just stay at it. Okay, well, Jung is also beautiful and wonderful and inspiring, and also getting us involved with with deeper dimensions, with the unconscious, with the imaginal, with symbols and archetypes and all kinds of wondrous. And also a sacrificial person who dove deep and that was in a way that's very wonderful. And that's why we're turning to Sean Kelly to tell us about Jung. Right. I didn't drink.
Thank you, Robert. That was great. Lots of points of contact that I can imagine right away, and I'll see if I can bring some of those up as we go along. So, can you hear me all right? Everybody hear me all right? Good. I actually wanted to begin with two sentences that sort of provide a kind of theme for what I'm hoping will come out in our time together, and that might be an invitation for you if you care to go deeper into Jung's writings and thought. And the first one is, and I have Rick, Rick Tarnas, our beloved friend and colleague, to thank for drawing this to our attention. It's from a letter that Jung wrote, and I don't know what year it was, but it's in volume 2, the second volume of the collected letters, on page 436, if those of you want to look it up. And Jung apparently said in this letter, "The real history of the world seems to be the progressive incarnation of the deity." And that's a very strong thing to say. I'll say it once more. The real history of the world seems to be the progressive incarnation of the deity. Now, of course, what does he mean by that? I can't claim to really know. I've spent many years thinking about it, so hopefully I'll have something helpful to say. But right now, I'm not going to say too much about it. I'm just going to leave that with you and add this other sentence to it. So if you remember that sentence, the real history of the world is the progressive incarnation of the deity, with this sentence. I got it right here. 559. Oh yes, there it is. Without the experience of the opposites, there is no experience of wholeness, and hence no inner approach to the sacred figures. I'll say that again. Okay, so remember the first one, the real history of the world is a progressive incarnation of the deity. Okay, so history is the divine or the sacred making itself, or trying to making itself more and more real over time. We will talk about what this notion of incarnation means. But here he says, without the experience, now it's the individual, not the grand historical process. Without the experience of the opposites, there is no experience of wholeness, and hence no inner approach to the sacred figures. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, the first sentence I think we'll look at more tomorrow, but the second one about the experience of the opposites as being essential for the experience and the actualization of wholeness, on the one hand, and for a direct relationship to the sacred figures. Now, what does that mean, the sacred figures? Leave it open a little bit, but the first element is an experience of the opposites and the importance of having opposites. Now, Robert mentioned in Steiner's case the co-presence of the esoteric and the exoteric, the invisible and the visible, right? The sacred and the profane. These, however you want to cut these two main levels, that they're somehow so different. They're certainly different in our experience, and in our culture they have grown further and further apart for many of us. But for Steiner and for Jung, the goal is somehow to learn to see these apparent opposites together. And to the extent that we can do that, we can have an experience of what Jung calls wholeness. And that is somehow related to having a relationship to the sacred, to these sacred figures. Okay? So let's look at a few high points in Jung's life where this principle of the opposites, of wholeness, the relationship to the sacred, becomes obvious or more obvious or apparent. To begin with his parents. So he's born in 1875 in Switzerland. His father is a Reformed Lutheran pastor. By all accounts, a very good man, loving man, principled man, who at the same time, despite his commitment to his faith, had lost his faith. Strove for years to have a living relationship to God, to the sacred images, to the sacred figures. But for whatever reason, was not able to have that. And Jung recounts the really disturbing sight of seeing his father praying, and he could feel the agony, the sort of soul agony of his father, who I imagine was feeling cut off from a direct living relationship to the divine. So his father's a pastor who is nevertheless forsaken, God forsaken. His mother, on the other hand, Emily Preiswerk, daughter of a well-to-do local family, seems to have been psychically gifted, although also emotionally and perhaps psychologically unstable. She did have to go away a couple of times when Jung was young. When Jung was young. So the young Jung ended up having to be apart from his mother, and that had a profound effect on him for that period that she was away. On the other hand, when she was around, that also had an effect on him because she got very strange, particularly at night, where she would converse with spirits. She would see spirits, and Jung also one night saw a spirit coming out of her room. And so we have, on the one hand, the father, who is an official external representative of a relationship to the sacred, who is God-forsaken. Then we have a mother who is supposed to be a kind of typical, stereotypical stay-at-home mother at the time, who has a direct living relationship to the invisible world. Okay. Interesting tension or contrast in his parents here. Now, Jung, if you're interested, if you haven't read Memories, Dreams, Reflections, I highly recommend it. It's just packed full of memories, dreams, and reflections, strangely enough. But very, very engaging and many of them very inspiring. And one of the experiences that Jung recounts is not a dream, it's a kind of waking vision. And it happened when he was preparing, at the same time that he was preparing for his formal initiation into the Lutheran Church. And he was quite excited about this period, actually. He was reading in the Catechism, and he was fascinated by this notion of the Trinity, especially. And he asked his father at one point, you know, when are we going to get to the Trinity? You're going to tell me what the Trinity is all about. His father said, oh, nobody understands. I don't understand that. And that was it. It was just, right? So, but in any case, Jung was still quite vital and at this period of his life, and he recounts one day where he was walking, I think he was walking to school, and it was a sunny day, and you could see the light glistening off the shiny roof of the Basel Cathedral, and he thought, oh, what a beautiful world, sunny day, God's in heaven, and all of a sudden he started getting gripped by this sort of anxiety and that he choked down. And for the next few days, he struggled with what sounds like sort of panic attack, a kind of panic attack that got him thinking, what's going on? Some unbidden thought was trying to arise in him, which he couldn't quite accept. And this led this young kid into a long internal theological contemplation about that led him to the conclusion that, all right, God created me God created Adam and Eve, I'm a descendant of Adam and Eve, the world was created by God. If I'm having this thought or this impulse that's coming from me, it must somehow have its origin in God, because I didn't create it, right? So once he had a kind of theological justification for allowing himself to have the thought, it came to him. And the thought was, or the image was, it's a beautiful day, and God is up in heaven sitting on his throne, the cathedral is glimmering below. God looks at it and lets a giant turd fall from the sky, which shatters the cathedral. Now, you may think that's a little funny, but for a young kid, the son of a Protestant pastor who's preparing for his formal initiation into the church, to have this image of a defecating God who is destroying his church was quite shocking. But so this became one of his very early secrets. He didn't tell this early vision to anybody, apparently, until I believe he recounted it here to Aniela Jaffe. Or when he wrote it, actually he wrote it himself. The first part of the book is actually written by him. So here we have another example of these opposites, these seemingly irreconcilable opposites. A spiritual deity in heaven who's supposed to be a God of love and light, who's somehow associated with what people normally consider to be dirty and involved in an action of sort of rageful judgment. So love, judgment, spirit, matter. I mean, really matter, matter at its crassest. Okay? So he has many such experiences as a young kid that you can look at on your own. But now I bring you up to the time where he's gotten through school. Well, I should say that before he ended up in university for this whole period of his early childhood, he ended up adapting to these unbidden experiences, immediate experiences, dreams, visions, impulses, and so on, by recognizing that he had actually another personality, which he actually called personality number 2. So to himself, he started referring to personality number 1 and personality number 2. He didn't know at the time that there were French and German psychologists, some of the first psychologists in the 19th century, who had been studying people that now we call multiple personality disorder. They'd invented this notion of dissociation, that the psyche or the personality is not actually a monolithic thing, that it has many parts which normally function together harmoniously, but for some people, these parts can lead more or less independent lives. Now, Jung had at least 2 personalities, one that he could identify. Number 1 personality was the well-behaved son that everybody from the outside knew, who was rather clumsy, socially awkward, but doing what he needed to do to get through life. Actually very bad at math, but good at some other things. The number 2 personality was, as he described him, an elderly man who was well dressed in late 18th century clothes and who was extremely wise, very confident, and knew exactly what was right in terms not only of what's right to do in certain situations, but was wise. Now, this is rather odd. Okay, so this is how he adapted. And eventually, however, he realized he was going to have to choose which of these 2 personalities to give his main allegiance to. And he decided that he would have to put number 2 personality aside and stick with number 1 if he was going to adapt in the world. Now, it was a good choice, because if he hadn't done that, probably he would not have made it to college, and we would not have his works. He wouldn't have had he wouldn't have been able to realize his destiny, and we wouldn't be here tonight talking about him. So he put number 2 aside, just as an aside, this number 2 personality, if you believe in rebirths, seems to have had some connection either directly with Goethe or with what was rumored to be Goethe's illegitimate son, who was actually Carl Jung's great-grandfather. Okay? This is family myths. There's no real proof for this. So he goes to university. This was a bit of a challenge for him because he was interested in so many things from very early on. He was interested in philosophy, like Steiner, like Buber. I didn't know that. Very young, at a very young age, Jung was reading not only Goethe's Faust, but Kant. He says that he was steeped in Kant by the time at least he entered college. He had been poring over Kant. It's strange. If you've never read Kant, it's hard to imagine a teenager poring over Kant. I know I couldn't do that. I was poring over The Lord of the Rings for as long as I could, but not Kant as a teenager. So he did get to university and decided to go into medicine, and particularly eventually what we call psychiatry, although actually the term may have just been invented. The term that was used before psychiatry was invented was alienist, which is interesting. So people who, not professionals who deal with aliens, but professionals who deal with people who have an inner other and a problematic relationship to an inner other. So to alien, alias, means other in Latin. Alienated, so alienated people. Because he thought that, okay, here's a chance by becoming a psychiatrist that he could bring these, at least two sides, not all sides, but two sides of his personality together. On the one hand, what we might call non-ordinary states of consciousness, particularly as we see them in neurotic symptoms, psychotic symptoms, and do it from the safe perspective of science. That's why he chose psychiatry. Now, he also did his doctoral dissertation after his medical training. In 1902, he completed his dissertation, the title of which was On the Psychology and Pathology of So-Called Occult Phenomena. This is his doctoral dissertation. And what it was actually a study of a trance medium. And this shows us another indication of the opposites that were at work, particularly in his own life, but also in the culture. And I'll just pause here for a second. We're at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, so the threshold of the 20th century. And on the one hand, what we see is a very impressive rise of industrial civilization, mechanistic science, and a materialistic worldview. And so throughout the 19th century, as we approach the 20th century, we have the birth of chemistry, biology, physiology, the consolidation of physics. It seems that the Newtonian Cartesian paradigm, the mechanistic worldview, has been completely sewn up together, and that it's answering all the questions and it's helping us produce all of this technology. This is the main current of history at this time. At the same time, toward the end of the 19th century, you have this wave, a countercultural wave that actually emanates very quickly from upstate New York and ends up covering the whole of the United States and all of Europe and going to South America, and that's the wave of spiritualism, where very suddenly, within a decade, and certainly by the end of the 19th century, you have tens of thousands of people from all walks of life, in the countryside, in the cities, but rural people, farmers, but also heads of state. Abraham Lincoln and his wife were having seances in the White House. And by some accounts, it was actually a medium that was invited to the White House who approached Lincoln at one of these seances and said, "You must do something about slavery." This is, I can give you a reference for this. All right, so it's also about this time, of course, in England that the Society for Psychical Research was founded by some of the leading scientific minds and philosophical minds of the time. So on the one hand, it's very strange. Materialistic science is just steaming, full steam ahead, right? Actually, yeah, it is steam. It's still, no, it's cold. There's coal, and I guess the early combustion engine has just been built. On the other hand, it's like this counter-movement of spiritualism has just spread everywhere. You have seances popping up. Now, so Jung had a cousin on his mother's side who was a trance medium. And he decided to use her as his subject for his doctoral dissertation. He didn't reveal that at the time. It was an anonymous subject. But he attended all of these seances with her and witnessed firsthand apparent communication with spirits, all sorts of interesting facts coming up, which Jung, however, tried to interpret psychologically, not spiritualistically. So again, he was looking at the spiritualist phenomena, but trying to apply the new thinking in psychology that was being developed at the time. Namely, that the personality is not just one thing, it's multiple, and it has at least two layers. The conscious layer that we're normally aware of, and what Frederick Myers called a subliminal area, or what Freud eventually called the unconscious. So conscious and unconscious. At the conscious level, we feel we're one and unified and integrated. But it doesn't take much to, if we're true with ourselves, if we're honest with ourselves, to realize that, at least speaking personally, I'm not as integrated as I would like to believe. I'm not as consistent as I would like to believe. I have a single body, that's true. But, okay, well, I could dwell on this, but I won't. I'll pause here for a second. 1902, this was actually the time, Theosophy, wasn't it? You were saying?
Steiner joined the Theosophical.
Oh, 1902? What was I thinking? What was the date again of the lectures on Theosophy? No, the occult science. When was that?
1909. But How to Know Higher Worlds was 1904.
1904. Okay, 1909. All right. Well, in 1907, he meets Freud in person. They had been corresponding for a little time before that, and it was more or less love at first sight when they met each other. They walked for like 12 hours straight in Vienna, talking nonstop. It was clear that these two people had a destiny to do something together for the next 4 or 5 years, which they did. Jung was younger by around 15 years, I believe. So Freud was a kind of father figure. And under the influence of Freud's personality, Jung at first repressed, to use Freud's language, put aside some of his own characteristic interests in philosophy, in the occult, and so on. But eventually, he couldn't keep it back anymore. And that was part of the reason why he broke with Freud around 1913. Okay? Now, have any of you seen the movie A Dangerous Method? Just curious how many of you have seen it. Okay. Well, it's a mixture of relatively accurate and completely made up stuff, but the psychological part and the relationship with Freud seems quite accurate. I'm wondering, would you mind closing that door? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Robert. So, I mean, at one point, Jung was Freud's chosen successor. Freud called him his crown prince. Freud thought that Jung was going to take over the International Psychoanalytic Association and do what Freud as a Jew couldn't do, and that would be to give full credibility to psychoanalysis, which was in danger of being dismissed as Jewish psychology. And Jung was totally on board with this until he realized that he just couldn't restrict himself to the principles of Freud's psychology. And that precipitated a break, particularly after Jung wrote his first, not really mature book, his first book where his own soul nature started to shine through, and that was a book called The Psychology of the Unconscious, which now you can read as Symbols of Transformation. It's now available as Symbols of Transformation. That was in 1911. And once Freud got the book, that was the end. Freud saw that, okay, we're over here. We don't have time tonight to go into the nature of this book and why was Freud so unhappy with it. But the main reason is that in this book, Jung refuses to reduce the sacred images, the sacred figures of religion, mythology, world religions and mythologies, to a single element, namely the sex drive and the Oedipus complex. I mean, he recognizes that sexuality, the body, are essential for understanding the evolution of consciousness and religion. But he wants to look, in this book, he wants to look at the religious function and the symbol as something which can't be reduced to anything else, but on the contrary, actually can serve a transformative function in the evolution of consciousness. So in this book, he's looking at you might say, the forward-looking transformative potential of religious images and symbols, instead of reducing them always to the past and to early childhood. And that was unacceptable for Freud. Okay, so his relationship with Freud breaks. It's also at this time that Jung breaks off his relationship with his first patient, Sabine Spielrein. If you watched, there's another movie you can watch actually on YouTube for free. I'm trying to remember that. I can't remember the title of it now. It's actually a better movie in terms of capturing Sabine Spielrein and the possible relationship between Sabine and Jung. But what we do know is that she had a profound influence on Jung. It seems that they very quickly fell in love with each other. And their personal relationship started to draw out of, particularly Sabine's imagination, all sorts of mythic figures, Siegfried, and from German myth and from other sources, but mostly German myth. And they talked about this. But eventually, Jung was just married 2 years earlier, and he loved his wife. This relationship with Sabine had completely overwhelmed him. This young, basically imaginative religious genius who comes into his office, extremely neurotic. He did cure her in fairly short order. But eventually, she had to leave. He realized it couldn't work. So Freud is gone, Sabine is gone. Jung collapses, or his personality starts to, the structure of his number one personality starts to shatter. He starts seeing less patients. He stops teaching. And he goes into a period of about a 4-year period of what could be called the dark night of the soul, which in retrospect can also be seen as a prolonged initiation. It wasn't a 7-year initiation, but it was about a 4-year initiation, in the process of which he intentionally cultivated and amplified his visions and dreams, recorded them in a series of black books. A few years later, transcribed these into what became known as the Red Book, to which he also added images and paintings. How many of you have seen the Red Book? Okay, quite a few of you. If you haven't, it's really worth looking at. Now, this is a book that I had heard of when I did my dissertation on Jung and Hegel in 1988, and I'd heard of the Red Book, and I'd seen a couple of plates, and never thought that I would see it in my lifetime. And very few people had seen it. But it was, for some reason, the Jung family finally agreed to have it translated and published in a facsimile edition. So you can get this big red book now. Now, just to give you a little taste, I'll read you just a couple of sentences from the Red Book. I have it. So, Jung didn't write this for the world to see, although, yeah, he didn't think that it would ever be published, and it wasn't published in his lifetime. I thought and spoke much of the soul. I knew many learned words for her. I had judged her and turned her into a scientific object. I did not consider that my soul cannot be the object of my judgment and knowledge. Much more are my judgment and knowledge the objects of my soul. Therefore, the spirit of the depths forced me to speak to my soul, to call upon her as a living and self-existing being. I had to become aware that I had lost my soul. From this we learn how the spirit of the depths considers the soul. He sees her as a living and self-existing being. And with this, he contradicts the spirit of this time, for whom the soul is a thing dependent on the human, which lets herself be judged and arranged, and whose circumference we can grasp. Yeah? That's pretty profound. And all through here, he's speaking in the third person to, let's say, us, or to an imagined reader, but often he's speaking directly to the soul, and she answers him. Okay? So, Jung later wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, referring to the Red Book and this period, he said, the years when I was pursuing my inner images, so this period of 1913 to 1918, this period when I was pursuing my inner images were the most important in my life. In them, everything essential was decided. It all began then, and later details are only supplements and clarifications of the material that burst forth from the unconscious and at first swamped me. It was the prima materia, the raw material for a lifetime's work. Okay? It shows you how seriously we need to take the Red Book and that period. Okay, so again, we see Jung having gone through the training in the outside, in the external world, to get his medical degree, his doctor of philosophy, to be the representative of a leading new movement, psychoanalysis. He's seeing patients, he's married, family, totally in the world, on the one hand. On the other hand, he is being gifted or cursed with a series of feelings and impulses, images, dreams, which for some people would constitute a crippling psychosis in contemporary terms. We call it that. If you were alive today, probably it's unlikely that he would have been able to, well, who knows? If it was him, I guess he would have been. But many of us, were we to be visited with such images and impulses, it's hard to imagine that I would have the discipline and the good fortune to be able to give it form the way that he did, to contain it and nurture it long enough so that it could stabilize. And then he emerged. Now, when he emerged, when this was done, now, what else is going on here? Well, the First World War, during this period, toward the end of it, the First World War. He's having to do service, a little bit of service as a medical doctor. And one of the things that he did, how are we doing for time? I've got 10 minutes, right? I think. Yeah, but I mean, we're going till 9, right? Okay, yes. 11 minutes. During the First World War, he'd get up every morning when he was on duty, and he found himself spontaneously drawing these circles that he would later recognize as mandalas and call them mandalas. He didn't know what they were at the time. He didn't know why he was drawing them. He just felt good doing it every morning. And he realized that they were different every morning, and they constituted a kind of psychogram, he called it, of his state at the moment. And it wasn't until later that in 1927, when Richard Wilhelm, a sinologist, a German sinologist, scholar of Chinese literature, history, and philosophy, sent him this text, The Secret of the Golden Flower, an ancient Chinese alchemical text, where Jung recognized in one of the descriptions something very close to one of the mandalas that he had painted, and saw, started to get a sense of why he had been doing this. Now, I'm skipping stuff here because we don't have time, but in 1927, after Wilhelm sent him The Secret of the Golden Flower, you have a shift in Jung's interest toward alchemy, on the one hand, and to a more sustained relationship with Eastern thought as well. He'd always been aware of and somewhat interested in Eastern thought. But after his meeting with Wilhelm, he became interested in the I Ching, for instance, Taoism, but especially alchemy. Maybe we'll have time to say something about alchemy tomorrow. I'm not sure in the context of the evolution of consciousness. So from 1927 over the next pretty much 30 years, he's going to devote more and more of his attention to alchemy, comparative religion, East-West dialogue. And toward the end of his life, another collaboration with a colleague of Einstein's, Wolfgang Pauli, one of the first-generation quantum physicists who won the Nobel Prize for Physics at a certain point, and is remembered in the physics community for the so-called Pauli exclusion principle in physics. Pauli actually came to Jung as a patient who suffered from, it would appear, chronic depression and also a kind of God-forsakenness, but was greatly helped by his time with Jung. They became friends and eventually collaborators, published a book together on the nature of the psyche, on nature and the psyche, I think it's called. But perhaps you are familiar with their joint creation, which is the notion of synchronicity. Now, maybe tomorrow we'll be able to get into synchronicity a little bit more. But, bless you. So synchronicity in many ways it's the last main theoretical achievement of Jung's life, is to propose a principle for that might allow the late modern mind that is conditioned to respect science, rightfully so, that has spent the last 300-400 years disciplining the mind in its relationship to the natural world through the scientific method to reveal more and more things about the nature of matter. To try to allow that kind of mind to make sense of what human beings have always known and believed since we were humans, which is an awfully long time. Namely, that everything is connected in the world, invisibly connected, that behind the veil, as it were, of the senses is a subtle web of interconnectivity that goes not only non-locally from place to place, but across time. Now, every religious cultural tradition has its own way of looking at this, and we might think of it as an enchanted worldview, where nature, the world, is experienced as being suffused with a divine principle, with spirit, where individual lives and collective stories have a meaning. They're not just random events. All of this had been progressively, these traditional ways of looking at and experiencing the world had been progressively demolished over the previous few hundred years. Now, with the principle of synchronicity, we at least have the possibility of trying to understand in a way that is paying due respect to the scientific mind, since it's in dialogue with the foundations of science itself, quantum mechanics, physics, relativity, how we might reintroduce enchantment to the world. So this is what synchronicity is about. Now, I'm assuming you know about synchronicity. How many of you know what I mean by synchronicity? Okay, there's a few of you who are maybe not quite so sure. Well, somebody you haven't thought of in 5 years, and you haven't seen them in 10 years, but for some reason you think of them and you mention them to a friend, and the next day they call you, right? Okay. There's no way that you could have known ahead of time. There's no way that some signal could have gone from you to that person, and yet there it is, right? Now, these things happen all the time, and the skeptic would say, well, it's just coincidence. Jung says, well, yes, it is a coincidence, but it's a meaningful coincidence. And those of us who experience them, especially certain of them that we experience, have a feeling of immediate, there's a kind of immediate conviction that comes with the experience that it's not merely random, that there's somehow, even if we can't figure it out, there is a meaningful connection. Now, what is this meaningful connection? For Steiner, it might be other beings who are somehow involved in the situation that we can't see. Jung didn't speculate about that. He, first of all, and we'll get into this tomorrow with the nature of science and knowledge, how do we know things? He, first of all, just wanted to say, look, let's be true to experience, first of all. And if we are, we see that these things happen. If they happen, how can we account for it, given our scientific understanding of the world? So this is what he tries to do with the principle of synchronicity. And in it, he is led to, in his later, so his reflections on synchronicity culminate with his later thought on alchemy, where he resurrects this term from a 17th century British alchemist, Gerard Dorn, that Dorn used to describe the ultimate stage of the alchemical process of transformation. And that is the stage of the unus mundus, the one world, the unus mundus. Okay? So, what synchronicity is about from the point of view of psychology and physics is what this alchemist was trying to get at with the notion of the true goal of the work, of the great work, which is somehow to gain direct experiential access to the fact that we all live in a unitary, integral world. Now, that might seem obvious, but the implications are profound. Right? Ecologically, we're starting to feel what that means. There's no away, as you said, Robert. But for those who have eyes to see, And for those whose eyes are particularly open, such as Steiner and Jung, there are ways of actually experiencing our subtle connections with not only other places and times, but other dimensions of this world that we all cohabit together. So such is the unus mundus. And that's it for my time. Okay? All right? Okay.
So we should stay, I think, huh? Should we? So we were going to have a little exchange now?
We were, but we could also just have an all. But if you have something on the tip of your tongue, why don't you go?
No, it's not like that. We'd have to build up something.
We would?
How many people have a question? Let's talk. How many could get a question in the next minute or two?
I see 4 or 5,
We'll
6.
take questions, and then we can always go back and forth.
Yeah, we could take
Yeah,
questions
sure.
now. Now, do we need a?
Yes, please. Martha.
Would
Okay,
you,
1 second. What we have to do
Just a
this.
second.
Oh, you've got it there? Thank you. Very good, Irene. And is this on? Oh, it is on.
Martha, yeah.
Aye.
would Jung's struggle with personality number 2 be something like what's termed today dissociative identity disorder?
Very good question. If you look at the diagnostic and statistical manual, for psychiatric disorders and so on, if you're thinking in terms of psychopathology and classification, yes, he would quite likely have, I would imagine, certainly at that time, at certain times of his life, could be classified in that way. Does that totally explain what was going on for him? Probably not, especially since, well, this is a good question. How do we know, right? How do we distinguish between pathology, psychopathology, which we normally think of as a kind of disease or disorder, on the one hand, from just something out of the ordinary on the other, a non-ordinary experience that doesn't fit into regular categories, especially if that non-ordinary experience comes with certain gifts. I mean, how do we distinguish between those two? In transpersonal psychology, some people try to get out of this by distinguishing between transpersonal and prepersonal, but it's very hard to sort out. William James in The Varieties of Religious Experience says that the things that come to us, these non-ordinary experiences, he says that seraph and snake lie side by side in these experiences. So, and for James, as for Jung, the question would be, well, what can we do with these experiences? Do they lead to greater insight and compassion and creativity, or do they lead to destruction and pain? So if we take that more pragmatic approach, then we can start to make some helpful distinctions, maybe. But I think Jung would be reluctant to categorize it too soon. Although for other people he might not. I mean, I've seen him even in films. He speaks very confidently about psychosis and so on. But whether he would have considered his own experience psychotic, I don't know. Many people do. Mm-hmm.
Freudians certainly do.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, I missed the name of the person you mentioned when you were talking about Jung connecting synchronicity and alchemy. Right. And I'm just really interested in that. Just would love to hear the name and books related to that. The Alchemist.
So the alchemist's name was Gerard.
Did you write it on the board?
Oh, yes.
Notes to write on the board.
Tomorrow I'll write more on the board because I think diagrammatically. It's hard for me not to move my hands and do diagrams, but Gerard Dorn, and he has this notion of the unus mundus, the one world. And this is, if you want to read more about it, it's actually in one of the most, probably the most difficult of Jung's books, because there's so many quotes, most of them in Latin and Greek and so on, although they're mostly translated, but it's still very hard. It's in Mysterium Conjunctionis. Volume 14 of the collected works. So it's volume 14. Mysterium Conjunctionis. So the mystery of the coming together of things, right? Which is what alchemy is about, is about separating out and putting together, synthesizing things. Of course, modern chemistry came out of alchemy. But here he's more interested in the process of symbolic transformation that accompanies working with these substances. Okay. Does that answer your question? Okay. You're welcome.
Where's the microphone?
In a similar vein, what was the name of the book? The Chinese treatise.
The Secret of the Golden Flower.
Thank you.
The Secret of the Golden Flower. Mm-hmm.
And Jung's writing about that is in Psychology and Religion, East and West.
That's right. Volume 11. There are 20 volumes of the collected works. Apparently, that's only about half of what he wrote, but thankfully, for when I was writing my dissertation, all 40 weren't out. Sorry, who had their...
Questions, yes.
Could you say something about the philosophy of freedom and where that fit in with Steiner's, all that he wrote?
I could.
Thanks.
Questions about philosophy of freedom, which is the hardest question I could have been asked, but I'll see what I can do. Some people are, not because they're particularly trained in philosophy, they just that's their book, and they just see it as a spiritual path, and it really works for them. And other people get involved with various parts of Steiner and anthroposophy, and they just don't relate to the philosophy of freedom. But if we were to relate to the philosophy of freedom, this is what would be good about it. Namely, Rudolf Steiner in this book tries to help us, the reader, first off to slow down and read in an extremely deliberate way. So the book, in a certain sense, is self-validating. If you slow down the way he suggests, you may find out that what he is saying is true. But if you read it the way we ordinarily read, then it won't turn out to be true, because it will just be thoughts and ideas, but not an actual schooling in how we can break the cycle of derivative thinking on automatic pilot and break into a new thought by joining my ability to make a concept. All right, I'm a concept-making person by virtue of being a human being, and joining it correctly to the perceptual world, the world that precedes concepts. We inherit them, not very thoughtfully or deliberately, as coming together. But if we would slow it down and proceed and join the concept, all right, then we would be making original knowledge, not by making up the world, but by relating to the way the world really is in its depth. That's part one. Part two is about ethics, and it says if you could do that in thinking, then you should be able to do it in action. And that's very important, because you will then do what is rightly your deed, coming from your own karma, from your personality, from your history, and your destiny. You will commit the deed, not that anybody would commit, but that you uniquely would commit. So you then join your deepest aspiration to this situation, this opportunity, this configuration. Very like in part one, you join the right concept with the percept. Now you're joining your moral will, and in such a way as to resolve this situation. And Steiner says that the spiritual world is related to the natural world, or the earthly, ordinary human world, in such a way that we can, all of us at the same time, have an original thought and an original moral deed, and if they are true to each person's karma, he says, they will be harmonious. They won't be the same, but they won't be contradictory. It's a big act of faith, and I don't know that it's falsifiable or verifiable, but it's quite an important idea. So Steiner is, I would have asked John, have you come up to discuss about this idea of the conflict, the opposites that's necessary for the whole, and that's true for both of them. They're both polarity thinkers. At the same time, they're both radical pluralists of perspective and of phenomena, and so unlike some anthroposophists and some other people who are dogmatists in other areas, Steiner is very positive about the wide variety of truths. There are as many truths as there are people. So that there's no one account, including his account. He never says his account is the true account, it's his account, which he recommends to people to try out and see what you can do with them, etc. So the philosophy of freedom really is a freeing of our thinking that can and should be in deepest possible harmony with our karma, our destiny, our deepest soul nature. But it's hard to get from the page to that. It's a hard book. But for some people, it's just exactly right. Other people learn this by painting, or by dealing with children, or farming. Namely, how do I do what is exactly original and true to my nature, and at the same time, true to the spiritual world, which my nature is also related to. So it's holding many parts together.
Okay.
Close.
Yeah,
Close.
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Palmer has a little book that's helpful. What Rudolf Steiner says about his book is very helpful when you read what he thinks he was doing. Other places too. Quite a few books. If you look at the catalog, you'll find lots of books on philosophy of freedom, and the book itself is very wonderful. And for some people. Yeah, there you go.
I have a question for the two of you. In hearing a little bit of the biography of both Steiner and Jung, I'm struck by the engagement with invisible occult realities in both of their histories. With Steiner, at that young age, the visitation, the ant, then the experience of the Christ nature, and with Jung, the seances, and then the period of the Red Book when all these sacred figures from Philemon, and other figures enter the consciousness. And I'd just like to hear from both of you, since this seems so crucial, this background, both of them, if you can venture any kind of comparison about the character and kind of their relationship to these invisible figures, however you classify them. They might not all be of the same kind. And how they take that then into their work and the world. Steiner's relation to the Christ on the one hand, Jung's relationship to, a figure like Philemon, which he keeps private. But there's something about a close similarity, and yet a very, also I think, a real difference in how they engage these invisible realities and work with them.
Well, maybe we'll say more tomorrow, but I think one of the things that's an immediate difference that strikes me, excuse me, is Jung's unshakable commitment to the limits set by Kant in terms of what we can know exists. Kant said that all that we can know is what we experience. We can't know something that's not part of our experience, right? We can think it, or you might say that thinking is part of our experience, but Kant was trying to be a good scientist, so he thought that if we can't have a sense experience of it, actually, Kant believed, it doesn't constitute a basis for knowledge, unless it's something like mathematics, which can be shown to be internally coherent, and we can have mathematical knowledge. So there's either mathematical knowledge, which we don't really need the senses for, although we may need the senses in order to awaken it. And then there's sense-based knowledge that science sort of brings together the mathematical and the sense-based. But spirits and God and the soul, said Kant, these are not, as Kant said, objects of possible experience for him. Kant and others realized that one of the reasons why we believe this is because cultures all have their own accounts of the spirit worlds, and they seem to be so different. They all have different accounts of God and different accounts of the afterlife and so on. So Jung wanted to place his feet firmly in the spirit of the times that was guided by science, the scientific method, and the philosophical sort of limits to knowledge that Kant had established at the end of the 18th century, around the time of the French Revolution. Whereas Steiner just throws that away. Isn't that right?
He throws it away, he breaks through it.
Well, no, but he just denies it. He just denies it.
Well, he
says
denies
the knowledge is not so limited.
Yeah, that's the words that he denies. It is that he affirms what he knows by his experience.
Yeah, but so does Jung. Affirms what he knows by his experience.
But he's not as consistent, because he knows through his experience that there is another side, and but he won't acknowledge it in philosophical scientific language. Well, with synchronicity, he really does. I mean, that's why I agree with you. It's so important. But what Steiner from the beginning is not. They both have scientists looking over their shoulder, and it's very expensive to make a statement that makes the scientists dismiss you. I mean, the scientists are the high priests of our culture. But and Steiner paid a high price by saying exactly what he experienced and what he thought, which was dismissed and is still dismissed by large segments of our thinking society. But he thought, and so for me the answer is biographical karmic, namely, Steiner came in order to reveal the other side. And there's no way that Kant was going to prevent him from doing that. By being so outspoken about, and here's what I've seen, and here are their names, and this is what they do on the other side and in relation to this side, he cost himself a lot of credibility. So he's not in the culture, in the intellectual culture, as successfully as Jung is, though he is actually in the culture in a bigger way through farming and Waldorf schools and a lot of other wonderful practical results. So practically he's been successful. But philosophically, you can't find a book in philosophy that mentions Steiner, or even a book in psychology. So it's a high price, and Jung understood that. So Jung was a doctor who wanted to heal people, and he knew the limits of what he could say if he was going to be taken seriously as a doctor. Steiner was an esoteric teacher. So if he didn't do that, then he wasn't an esoteric teacher. So they both, I think, went in the real world in ways that had a certain limitations that they knew would be costly or not. Jung held back in order to have a certain kind of success. I mean, he didn't hold back completely. He broke with Freud. A lot of people broke with him. He still, New York Times, New York Review of Books still don't treat him with respect. So there is a price for everything that crosses the Kantian line. Personally, I think that Jung limited his own genius by not forthrightly dealing with the fact that he knew better. He was having these amazing experiences. He didn't have the names for them the way Steiner did, but he was making breakthroughs at every turn. And synchronicity is just one of the vivid ways that he makes the connection between the conscious and the unconscious. So we talk about the ceiling, but in a way it's a little confusing. We get caught in our spatial metaphors because for Jung, the forbidden area that he breaks into is the unconscious, which we think of as under, etc. So we just have to turn it upside down. But it's a battle either way to cross the line. And experientially, he crossed the line many, many times. But Kant had him by the throat. Or the doctors, or Freud, or somebody that he wasn't as forthright as Steiner. By being forthright, Steiner then has passages and whole books that people say, give me a break. This is too far across the line. Nobody knows that, certainly not with all that degree of confidence. So we need them both. But I think Jung is about halfway to Steiner. But we need him. We could take him to certain dinner parties, we can't take Steiner. On the other hand, we know Waldorf schools, and Jung didn't give us Waldorf schools. Or biodynamic studying, a lot of other things.
That's true.
Other questions? That's John. Yeah, we need one of those.
Thank you. I wonder if both of you could take this whole question of polarities a step further.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
Oops.
No, it's you, it's me, it's not you.
Oh, okay. I wondered if both of you could take this question of polarities a little bit further. Both of you mentioned them. Both of you probably have them connected with Goethe's work, and yet you went very different places with them.
Okay. I mostly think about polarities in terms of Barfield, but Sean, you want to go first?
Well, polarities. I just found this it's related to this, but it actually ties together your question to the last thing here. Very, very brief. He says, if the unconscious can contain everything that is known to be a function of consciousness, then we are faced with the possibility that it too, like consciousness, possesses a subject. Right? Anyway, he says, this conclusion finds an expression in the common and ever-recurring use of the term subconsciousness. The latter term is certainly open to misunderstanding, as either it means what is below consciousness, or postulates a lower and secondary consciousness. At the same time, this hypothetical subconsciousness, which immediately becomes associated with a superconsciousness, and he goes on and on and on. So he says, my concept of the unconscious leaves the question of above or below completely open, as it embraces both aspects of the psyche. Right? So that's just on the unconscious, above, below. We do think of it as a depth dimension. But polarity, from Jung's point of view, there's a tradition of thinking in the West that goes back to Heraclitus, before Socrates. But you even see it in Plato. And then you see it, of course, in Christianity in a big way, with crucifixion, with the incarnation, these polarities of spirit and flesh, time and eternity, the infinite and the finite. So there's that whole tradition. Then also, though, particularly around the time of the French Revolution, you have romantic poets and philosophers like Goethe and Coleridge and Hegel, whose thinking is on fire with the dynamic tension of opposites and polarities. William Blake, in his beautiful book, actually is a prototype for Jung's Red Book. The real title of Jung's Red Book is Liber Novus, the new book, the new kind of book. But actually it wasn't that new. William Blake had done it before Jung, about 100 years earlier, with The Marriage of Heaven and Hell and his other books, but particularly The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, these two opposites, these polarities, right? So there's a strand of experience and thinking in philosophy and in literature that is centered around the dynamic tension of opposites. You see it in alchemy. All of that feeds into Jung in psychology. But I'm not sure about...
Curious, what's behind the question? What are you looking for?
You needed to have an ulterior motive?
Or just what would be a good answer?
Well, how do they deal with the both and?
How do they deal with
the both and?
Right.
They are both end thinkers.
Yes, but
Yeah.
they're very different.
Yeah.
They are different. Well, the way I think about it, I don't know if this is an answer to your question, but, Sean mentioned, I think you did, Lucifer and Ahriman, and we're going to talk about that in relation to evil. And so this all comes. We don't create this. I mean, the polarity is from the beginning. Sin and salvation or Lucifer. And so for Steiner, the ultimate both and is Christ. Christ is the holder